Today we're going to be talking about solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. And the quadratic formula is super important. It's the best way to solve quadratic equations unless you can't factor it. So you always start with factoring, and then if you have to, go to solving them using the quadratic formula. And I expect you to remember this. So our quadratic formula is here. And you're solving for the x numbers. So that's why it's x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And again, I expect you to memorize that. Please keep that in mind. Okay, so our first example here, solve by using the quadratic formula. The first thing you have to keep in mind is that your formula needs to be set equal to 0. So I subtract that 35 over to the other side, and then remember your quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So what I start with doing is let's list out our A, B, and C, just so that everybody understands what they are. A is always in front of the x squared term, so that's 1. B is next to the x term, so that's a negative 2. And C is what we call the constant, negative 35. Okay, so now it's just a matter of plugging in. Opposite of B, the opposite of negative 2 is 2, plus or minus the square root of b squared. Okay, so I'm just going to type this in, or write this in, negative 2 squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So inside here we have 4 plus 140 all over 2, so I have 2 plus or minus the square root of 144 all over 2. 144 is a perfect square, so I can simplify that to this. Now 2 plus 12 is 14 over 2, which is going to simplify to 7. 2 minus 12 is negative 10 over 2, which is 5. So let's look at this equation back here. The other way that I've really pushed you to solving these is to solve it by factoring. If you notice, and this should be a negative here, I apologize, this factors to x minus 7, x plus 5 equals 0. So then you set each one of your factors equal to 0. So we get the same thing whether we solve it by factoring or the quadratic formula. That's why if you can't factor, then use your quadratic formula. That's what you need to take away from this. Like, for example, this problem, you're not able to factor that. So we start plugging into our quadratic formula. Let's lay out our A, B, and C. A is the coefficient on the x squared term, so that's a 2. B is a negative 2. C is a negative 5. So the opposite of B, the opposite of negative 2 is 2, plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared minus 4. A is 2. C is negative 5 all over 2a. And again, remember, you're solving for x coordinates. You're solving for where this graph hits the x-axis. You're solving for the solutions. So technically, I always have bad notation with this. Technically, I should have that x equals there, so I'm going to try and work on that during this lesson. 4 plus 40 over 4 to plus or minus square root of 44 over 4. So then they want you to do this in your calculator and get the answer to the nearest tenth. So I do 2 plus root 44, press enter, then I divide by 4 and I get 2.2. And then if I do 2 minus square root of 44, press enter in my calculator, then I divide by 4, I get negative 1.2. So those are your two answers there. Okay, another one, solving by using the quadratic formula. So this one, again, lay out your A, B, and C. A is 5. B, negative 8. Oh, I got too excited about math. I sometimes do that. I didn't get it equal to 0. C in this case is negative 4. Now what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video and I want you to try and do this using the quadratic formula all on your own. Okay? I'm going to pause the video, try it on your own, and then see if you get the same thing that I get. Hopefully you pause the video like I asked. So opposite of B is 8 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So now I have 64 plus 80 all over 10. That turns into 144 over 10. So that turns into 8 plus or minus 12 over 10. So I do 8 plus 12, that's 20 over 10. So that equals 2. And then 8 minus 12, that's a negative 4 over 10, which reduces to negative 2/5. Hopefully you got 2 and negative 2/5. Now look how nice of numbers these are. These are such nice numbers here because this was a perfect square. If that's a perfect square, that typically means that you'd be able to factor technically this one down here. Okay. The discriminant. The discriminant is actually really cool. We can look at the discriminant, which is the piece underneath that radical, so that b squared minus 4ac. So that piece right there is what we call the discriminant. And it tells us the amount of solutions or the amount of intercepts we have. So if the discriminant is negative, we have no solutions. There's going to be no x-intercept. It's technically called imaginary solutions, but you'll get to that in Algebra 2. If b squared minus 4ac is equal to 0, your graph is sitting right on the x-axis. That's one x-intercept. If this is positive, then we have two x-intercepts. That means there's two solutions. So the discriminant tells us the type of solutions we're going to have. That's why I think it's actually really cool. Okay. State the value of the discriminant for each of the following, then determine the number of real solutions. Again, you have to get this equal to 0. And I'm always about working smarter, not harder. I almost said it wrong. Working smarter, not harder. So just use the discriminant. Don't plug it into the whole quadratic formula. Remember, your discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. So b squared is going to be 10 squared minus 4 times 3 times a negative 12. So that ends up to be 244. That number is greater than 0, which tells me I have two x-intercepts. Another way of saying that, I have two solutions. So my discriminant was 244. That told me I had two solutions. So for the next one, again, remember to get, I'm going to add the 12 over so I get it equal, our equation equal to 0. B squared minus 4AC. This ends up equaling 100 minus, I don't know why I scared myself on this one now, 144. That equals negative 44, so that's negative, so I have 0 solutions. Okay, and then the last example. Again, remember you're getting those equal to 0, so b squared, 4 squared, this is b, minus 4AC, I mixed those up. So 16 minus 16, I get 0. That tells me that there is one solution. And there you have our video on quadratic formula and the discriminant. Thank you for watching.